Okay, video 11 in the Unit 2 population series. This is the third of 4 videos in migration. And carrying on from the last one, we're going to be talking about distance decay and again, more tobularisms, that everything that's related, things that are closer related or more, things that are closer, I should say, are more related than things that are farther apart. I'll get that out straight. So mini migrations, therefore, are what we sometimes call step migrations. Instead of moving all the way from A to Z, you might move A to D, and then you might move from D to L, and then from L to R, and then from R to Z. So a bunch of steps along the way. And remember that every time that you stop, you may not continue that migration. So step migration, a series of stops and starts. So this goes along with this idea of distance decay, and that is the idea that things that are far apart will have less interaction than things that are closer together. And so again, remember the gravity model of migration that we talked about in the last slideshow. Two places that are closer together will have more interaction and therefore more migration between them. The other thing, of course, about the gravity model is it does take into account the size of the population. A bigger population has more sending power just by the law of probability. If there's more people, there's the more chance that someone will migrate. In a smaller population, not as many people will move. This slide basically is just a diagram showing you the intervening obstacles and or intervening opportunities. Really, those two words are interchangeable. One just signifies that it's a negative perception. The other that it's a positive perception. But again, those are down to personal issues. Remember that migration is very, very much an emotional decision. There are life stage migrations. Some people that are young, they're moving for work reasons. Some people that are older, they're moving for retirement reasons. Some people that are maybe middle-aged are moving for family reasons. And in your own personal movement and migration story, if you talk to your family, you might find that there are a lot of these intervening opportunities and obstacles that your parents or grandparents faced when they were moving. And in your future, you may see some of these same things as well. So what are these types of migrations? Well, basically, they're either voluntary or they are involuntary. And we'll start with the ones that are by choice. So these are the ones where push and pull factors are relevant, because if you are an involuntary migrant, you don't really have much of a choice. So it doesn't matter what the push or pull factors are, because you're not moving on your own free will. So when we think about voluntary migration, I mentioned just a second ago, young people often move for work. Your human capital is one of the most valuable things about you in your young life. You have tremendous potential. And therefore, as you finish high school and finish college or go into the world of work, your human capital will be very valuable. And you may decide to move to capitalize on your hard work. And then life course. Again, if you are starting to get up into your late 50s, early 60s, you may be starting to think about retirement. And you and your partner may say, wouldn't it be great to go live in the mountains or to go live on the beach or, go live in a different place than where you are currently residing. They call that life course migration. So chain migrations, we alluded to it in the last slideshow, and this is the kinship link. And almost always there's going to be a component of chain migration where remittances are involved. Remember that remittances are the monies that people who have migrated send back home to their country of origin. And in some countries in the world, these remittances account for a big portion of their GDP. Some family incomes, they get almost half of the money that they earn from relatives who live in other countries. We also should know that in Africa, like in any place in the world that is less developed, we see a lot of this movement from rural to urban. And as the big cities have better economic opportunities, it almost creates what we call islands of development. Instead of the whole country being developed, it's the bigger cities of the country that are developed. And the rural parts of the country are less developed. And so we see that that's a pattern a lot. And again, not just in Africa, but throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia. We also need to remember that today's migrants to the United States are much more of a skilled migrant labor force than the migrants who came into this country maybe 100 years or so ago. If you look at Ellis Island, and this is a cool picture, Eastern European migrants coming into the United States. Remember the Statue of Liberty, it says, send me your huddled masses yearning to be free, the tired and the hungry. Today's migrants generally are more educated. And particularly in the areas of medicine and technology, especially in terms of the skill sets from their college degrees in math and science and engineering. So when you think about migration, these two colors, red and green, highlight just the migration of Chinese and Indian people from East Asia and South Asia, respectively. So if you look at the United States, 3.5 million Chinese, 2.25 million Indian. Canada, smaller numbers, remember, because Canada's population is smaller in general, but they still take in a tremendous percentage. And then you can see that, Chinese concentrates in Southeast Asia, whereas the diaspora concentrates in the Middle East and in Africa. And this is, again, the patterns that we typically see because of guest workers in the oil industry. The pattern that we see here as people left the Chinese mainland and went to areas, big cities like Manila, big cities like Jakarta in Indonesia. I already mentioned Singapore in the last video. Kuala Lumpur has a very big expat Chinese population. Expat meaning expatriate, meaning that they've left their country of origin. So these are just good examples of seeing where people have moved into different parts of the world. Remember I said wherever you have an English-speaking population, you generally have a large Indian migration. So think about Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, and what used to be British Guiana, which is today just Guyana. These countries both have several 100,000 Indian migrants who've moved there for work opportunities. And if you've taken a cruise throughout the Caribbean, you've probably seen that many of the business owners in the hotels and retail shops will be migrants from South Asia. So when you look at this chart, it's going to show you a couple of peaks, and it would be important that you understand the years where these peaks occurred. And then, of course, the height of the peak is going to tell you how many migrants were admitted into the United States. And then the color coding is going to tell you whether they were from Europe, whether they were from Southern and Eastern Europe or Northern and Western Europe. And then, of course, you've got also Asia and Latin America. So a couple things in patterns here. Early migration history in the United States before World War II, most were Europeans. After World War II, we've seen an incredible increase in the number of Asian and Latin American migrants. For a long time in the United States, there were some really, really tough migration laws. We had a quota system for a long time in the United States. It definitely favored white Europeans. We even had for a short time an Oriental Exclusion Act because Chinese workers were coming to work on the railroads, and the nativist political parties didn't want these people to come. And again, this has always been this fear. People say, oh, the immigrants are going to take our jobs. The reality is the immigrants almost always take jobs that Americans didn't want to do. So even when you look at these peaks, you can see Southern and Eastern Europeans. This would be Italians and Russians and Greeks that came to America early in the 1900s, as opposed to back in the early days of the United States being, more British and Irish, and certainly the potato famine had something to do with this spike. Whereas you see these big dips. For example, World War I, it really drops low because during wartime, people don't migrate as much. Post-war, it jumps back up. The Depression, nobody really coming to America because there weren't any great opportunities in America. Unemployment was already over 25%. Post-war, the same thing. But as the United States economy recovers, a big increase again in migration. What's the big change about European versus Asian and Latin America? Remember in the Cold War, the United States is very anti-communist. Anywhere in the world that we were fighting to spread democracy and to protect the world from the spread of communism, we generally accepted migrants from those places, particularly the brain drain. We wanted the brightest and the best and the most technically gifted of those populations. So Cubans coming to America, Chinese coming to America, Vietnamese coming to America. During any of these conflicts in the Cold War, you would see a spike in the migration from those places. Of course, today, economically, again, we still see a lot of people coming from Mexico, Central America. We still see a lot of people coming from all over Asia, and those are big destinations, big source areas for this destination to the United States. So if you look at this, this is U.S. workers by place of birth. This is not all Americans. These are just people in the U.S. workforce. And most of them are, of course, born in the United States. Latin Americans, not surprisingly, make up the next biggest number. Asians after that. Notice it's about half. Europeans, again, about half of that. Africans, about half of that. And you'll notice that there's kind of a proportional, diminishment of people coming from these different places. So when you look at this, it just kind of reminds you that the United States does indeed have a very large migrant population, and that's always been a big part of the history of the United States. So what are the 5 leading sources of immigrants to the U.S.? All time, Mexico is still number 1. If you go back early in American history, obviously English and Irish were big, but also Germans. But in today's world, it's mostly Latin America and Asia. And you can certainly see this with Mexico, China, India, Philippines, and Cuba. Right? Don't forget, there's also a connection geopolitically and historically. Cuba, of course, the Spanish-American War only begins this long history that the United States has with Cuba. And my in-laws came in the 1960s in the Castro era. Philippines, remember, big U.S. possession up until 1947, also taken from Spain in the Spanish-American War, similar to Puerto Rico. Cuba, of course, remember, stayed independent, even though it was very much under American domination. India, most of this migration has come for economic reasons. This is why we get the relocation or migrant diffusion of Hinduism on our landscape, and you'll see that all across big cities of the United States. Chinese, obviously, West Coast is more prevalent, particularly up towards San Francisco, but even going up into Portland and Seattle, because if you fly from China to the United States, you'll hit those areas of our country first. And remember, everything's related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. So this just shows you the states in the United States that have a lot of immigrant populations. New York, clearly, everybody should know that. New Jersey, don't forget, just outside of the city, you can be in northern New Jersey and easily commute in and out of New York City. Illinois shows up, really mostly because of Chicago. Florida, of course, we know has a tremendous migrant population from the Caribbean, not just Cuba, but all over the Caribbean. Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, South Florida is of rich cultural diversity because of our Caribbean heritages that we see represented on our landscape. Obviously, Texas, Arizona, California. Remember that approximately 1 in 5 people in the United States are speaking a language other than English at home on a daily basis. Many of you hear something other than English at home at least some of the time. So these are excellent examples of the states where we see a lot of migration. So basically, these are just changing scale, where we can see the similar patterns that we see on the global map, but this one would be just our Latin American map, and this would be just the Asian map, and again, coming into the United States in the numbers. And again, remember, as always, these population numbers are not super reliable because it just depends on the date of the statistics. When were these numbers obtained? Remember that there's also forced migration or involuntary. One of the best examples, of course, remember the African slave trade. Whenever there is this forced migration, you often will see, similar to what we saw with China and India in the voluntary sense, you'll see a diaspora where you have an ethnically connected but separated across time and space. So because of the Holocaust, you do see an immigration pattern where the Jewish populations of Europe were spread out all over Europe from the Roman era on. And then particularly after the Holocaust, when the state of Israel is created, you see 1/3 of the Jewish population in the Middle East, 1/3 of the Jewish population in the world in Europe, and 1/3 of the Jewish population in the world in the Americas. We talked a little bit about counter-migration in the last slideshow. That's the deportation process. Remember that sometimes people do move for political reasons. For refugees, they have to have a well-founded fear, according to the UN. Not all refugees are automatically accepted. Some people will come hoping to be accepted as a refugee, but they are what we call asylum seekers, meaning they're not guaranteed to be able to stay. One of the best examples of that currently in the world is the Rohingya Muslims that are fleeing out of Myanmar. And you can look that case study up if you'd like to look at that. Millions of Venezuelans have left Venezuela. Most go to Colombia. Of course, it's a lot closer. They don't have to learn the language, but many come to Florida. Then there are also what we call internally displaced persons, or IDPs. These are refugees who have not crossed a border. They're still living in their own country, even though it's unsafe for them to live where they originated from. So they've fled their city or their town, but they haven't crossed an international border. Of course, again, this most famous of the involuntary migrations is the African slave trade. Millions were brought into the New World. Most people probably wouldn't guess that the fewest number of slaves was actually taken into British North America. By far, bigger numbers were taken into Brazil, for example, and especially the biggest number taking into the Caribbean. A fun fact, if you look at most of the flags of the Caribbean, you'll see that one of the colors on their flag is usually black, but also a lot of colors like green and yellow. Jamaica's flag is an excellent example of this. These are Pan-African colors, and so you'll see that they are basically kind of celebrating their ethnic heritage by remembering that the biggest portion of their populations today can trace their lineage back to Africa through the slave trade. Okay, sorry this one was a little bit long, but hopefully you got everything you need. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to text through Remind or come in and ask.